Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katy Stubbs, and I'm from Alzheimer's Research UK. I'm delighted to welcome you here today for the second event in our Lab Notes online series. These events are an opportunity for dementia researchers to share their work with you and to answer the questions that you put to them. This event and the others in the series are being recorded, so don't worry if you can't make one of them, as you can watch them back later. So before we get going, we're really interested to know a little bit more about you and your motivations for coming today. So we're just going to pop a few poll questions on your screen. And these questions are just asking a little bit about how you think your current knowledge of dementia research is, what describes your reasons for attending today, and also if this is your first dementia research event. And this is just useful information for us to kind of understand about who's coming along, and it helps us shape future events. So I'll just give everyone a little bit of time to pop their answers in the poll. And then hopefully you've all had a chance to do that, and we just can have a look at the poll results, please. So people kind of feel their knowledge is average. Hopefully you'll feel it's improved after the event today. Lots of people coming either because they have a loved one with dementia or their work is related to dementia, and a kind of a split between those who are coming along because they've attended a few events like this, and actually a good number, about 1 in 3 of you are at your first event. So that's very interesting to see. Thank you for doing that. So let me just share my slides and we can get going. So the plan for today is first a quick introduction from me before you'll then hear 2 talks, one from Dr. Aida Suarez Gonzalez and one from Dr. Ross Paterson. We'll then round off the event with a Q&A session, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible in the time that we have. We've had questions submitted in advance, and you can also ask questions during the event. To ask a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which will bring up the box where you can type your question in. So first up, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Alzheimer's Research UK and one area of our work. So we are the largest charity funder of dementia research in the UK, and our work focuses on biomedical research. So that's studies in laboratories and clinics that set out to understand more about what is happening in the brain in the diseases that cause dementia, and to find ways to improve how we can reduce the risk of these diseases, diagnose them better, and develop effective treatments. With today's research talks being about COVID-19, the brain, and dementia, I thought I'd focus my introduction on how the pandemic has affected the charity, the researchers we support, but also how we've adapted over the past year. So if you cast your mind back about a year ago, we were just about to head into the first lockdown. And what this meant for researchers was the laboratories were shutting. So they were winding down their experiments, they were putting resources like cells into storage, and some clinical studies were also paused. Our researchers did begin to work from home, and while that meant that they weren't able to generate new data, they focused their time on analysing existing data sets, writing research papers about their discoveries, and planning and prioritising for their return. During this time, as we were trying to work out the impact of the pandemic, the charity took the tough decision to pause awarding new funding, and we worked to protect the charity's finances and our existing funding commitments. But as the year went on, we got a clearer picture of the impact of the pandemic, and we now know we're about 35% down on the income we expected to fundraise over the past year. But the charity has shown good resilience and adapted to the challenges we faced over the last year. So thanks to our amazing supporters, we've actually recently been able to award funding to 6 new research fellows. And in June of this year, we plan to review the applications that were put on hold a year ago and award some new funding. We've also continued to support strategic initiatives like our Drug Discovery Alliance, our Early Detection of Neurodegeneration initiative, and the UK Dementia Research Institute. We've also been closely monitoring the impact of the pandemic on the research community. So while researchers have been able to return to the lab since the summer of last year, they've had to work on a shift system due to social distancing, which does mean research capacity is lower than normal. We know that projects have been delayed and some have sadly been terminated, and that challenges around research funding mean 1 in 3 dementia researchers are sadly considering leaving research together. This situation creates a risk that momentum in dementia research is lost, and we're working to plug gaps where we can, such as through the funding I just mentioned that we've recently awarded. A part of this, though, is that the government pledged to double dementia research funding during the 2019 election. And this funding is needed now more so than ever. I know Aida will talk about this in much more detail in her talk, but we know that COVID-19 has had a colossal impact on people with dementia. We currently have a petition running as a way to hold the government to their promise and have over 45,000 signatures so far. So if you haven't checked out our petition and put your name to it, please do consider doing so and saying to the government that this is really important and we need the increased investment in dementia research. One of the key areas of fundraising impacted by the pandemic has been community fundraising. So this is things like bake sales and sponsored walks, fundraising balls to supermarket collections. Community fundraising has felt a huge impact throughout the last year. But it has been amazing to see many of our supporters get really creative with new fundraising ideas to continue to support dementia research during the pandemic. So I just wanted to share a couple of examples. On the left of the screen, we have Tom Hudson from Yorkshire. And Tom ran 1 kilometre for every year his grandfather lived without dementia, totaling 65 kilometres. He ran this distance over just 13 days in memory of his grandfather and had strong support from his local community and football clubs, which helped him to raise a brilliant £2,335. On the right, we have Sinead McCurry from Scotland, who wanted to celebrate her 50th birthday in January by doing something different, which was a little challenging in lockdown. As an NHS doctor, she knows just how much dementia takes from those who we love. So despite the limitations of lockdown, she challenged herself to complete a 24-hour disco dance-a-thon in the comfort/confines of her kitchen. Sinead and her dancing shoes raised an incredible £6,738 for dementia research. And so Tom and Sinead are just two examples of our incredible supporters, raising vital funds for dementia research. So just want to give a little shout out that if you are interested in fundraising, it's your skills, your pastimes, and your personality that will be key to helping find the next big breakthrough in dementia research. So you might fancy hosting a bake away sale, or how about a virtual games night, or using that opportunity for daily exercise through your walks or your runs or your cycling to raise money. Our brand new fundraising pack has everything you'll need to get inspired and start planning your fundraising, even while social distancing. The packs are free and you can download a digital copy or order a printed version simply by visiting the website. And while I've just highlighted examples of fundraising, there are a range of other ways in which people can support our work, whether that's through volunteering, donating, leaving a gift in your will, or attending an event like this and telling others about dementia research. I just want to take the opportunity to say a huge thank you from everyone who supports us. It's hugely appreciated, particularly as we know it's been a really tough year. Another impact of COVID-19 has been shifting to holding events online. So for this Lab Note series event, we've been working with our research network. We provide funding to the network for small projects and pieces of equipment and to support networking collaborative work. And before the pandemic, each centre would organise an annual event to share their work with people in the local area. So we worked with them to bring these events online. At this event today, you'll hear from two scientists in our University College London network. Our speakers today have pivoted their work over the past year to study and understand the impact of COVID-19 on the brain and on people with dementia. You'll hear first from Dr. Aida Suarez Gonzalez and then from Dr. Ross Paterson before we move to the Q&A session. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aida Suarez Gonzalez and hand over to her for her talk. Just wait a moment as Aida gets her slides ready. And I think you're still on mute, Aida, if we just can get you off mute. There we go.
Yes, you can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sharing my screen and hopefully getting this right. So can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can. Over to you then.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction. So yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aida Suarez. I'm a neuropsychologist and researcher at the Dementia Research Centre at University College London. And first of all, I want to thank ARUC for inviting me to be part of this session and to all attendants for their interest on today's topic. So my plan for today is to give an overview of COVID mortality, impact, and policy affecting people with dementia across the world. And really, I've split my talk into these two big topics: mortality and the impact of isolation. And I'd really like to make a start talking about mortality of people with dementia during COVID. So in general, we already knew that people with dementia are more vulnerable to any infection because they tend to be older, more likely to have associated comorbidities like vascular disease, and they are more likely also to develop delirium and to experience greater functional loss during hospital stays. But besides that, over the last year, we've learned about many other variables that influence mortality due specifically to COVID infection. So this is the timeline of 2020, a year to remember forever for all the wrong reasons. And I would like to tell you the story of how our knowledge and understanding has evolved over the last 12 months. So a year ago, a very few months after the start of the pandemic, the first papers started to coming up and described that actually people with dementia were more likely to develop atypical presentations of COVID. This is something that we learned very early on. These atypical presentations were, for instance, presenting COVID presenting such as hypoactive delirium, which it is an atypical presentation of the disease. And in particular, in the early days, these kind of atypical presentations made more difficult the early recognition of symptoms. And therefore, this led to a delay in the provision of medical care. And at that time, we started seeing also the first signs suggesting that people with dementia might be particularly predisposed to more severe COVID presentations. And for instance, in this Italian cohort, a diagnosis of dementia was independently associated with higher risk of death after correcting by age. And soon after, this paper came up suggesting that being a carrier of ApoE4, a very well-known risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease, may also be associated with more severe COVID presentations. Then some external factors came into place, like for instance, the place of residence. This started to be considered a variable strongly associated to death by COVID in people with dementia. And this really makes a lot of sense because it is very well known that around 50% of all COVID-related deaths in many countries in the world correspond to people living in care homes. And we know that a large proportion of care home occupants are people living with dementia. So it is also expected that they also account for a large proportion of these deaths. And then we continued learning as new studies keep emerging. And this study for the States found that people with dementia still had higher risk of dying from COVID compared to patients without dementia after correcting for many confounding factors, like all those vascular risk factors and all those other factors that are associated with poor prognosis of COVID, and also correcting by place of residence. So really this association between dementia and COVID started really to solidify. And these two very recent meta-analyses also coincide in associating a diagnosis of dementia with increased risk of mortality due to COVID. And this is where we are at the moment, really, with dementia standing as an independent predictor of mortality due to COVID. And for those of you wondering why is this then? So at the moment, the authors that have worked on these papers, and they in their discussions, they actually considering this being the result of a combination of factors, including vascular, comorbid medical conditions related to old age, and also vascular comorbidity, also a delay in the diagnosis, so people arriving to receive the right treatment too late, and also the presence of APOE, which seems to be involved maybe in the immune response. So at the moment, really, we have strong variables contributing to the mortality of people with dementia. And to this list that you have in front of you in your screens at this moment, we should add something that happened in particular during the first wave, which is what I'm showing in this slide at the moment. So we know that access to hospital care for people living in care homes was denied in many places across the world. And here on your left-hand side, these are just a few examples of news about places where hospital transfer was refused for people living in care homes. Just to give you a taste of how global this problem has been, these are news from England, Wales, Madrid in Spain, Ottawa in Canada, Sweden, and France. And not only transfer to hospital, but also the protocols to access intensive care in some countries established criteria that place people with dementia at disadvantage. And there is documentation, there is proof that such concerning protocols were issued in countries like Italy, the UK, Switzerland, and Spain, to name a few, but this is likely to have been a generalized practice in many other places. And of course, all this situation has affected the access to palliative care for people living with dementia, in particular for people with dementia living in care homes. So let's now examine how all of this translates in terms of national mortality, both in the UK, and then we'll have a look at other countries. What you are seeing in this slide is the official data from the UK Office for National Statistics for the hardest months of the first wave, which shows that 20% of all COVID deaths in April in England and Wales had a diagnosis of dementia. So during this time, there was an 83% increase in excess deaths compared with the same period in the previous year. And we know that not only deaths due to COVID, but also non-COVID excess deaths in people with dementia were higher. And this is a very recent data released from the, again, from the Office for National Statistics from December 2020. And here you can see the peak of deaths in the hardest months of the pandemic. And this table describes the mortality registered up until September 2020 of people with dementia who died at home. And these are, again, excess deaths. Excess deaths are deaths that will not be expected according to the previous 5-year average mortality. So this is really an increase in the percentage of deaths that are expected for the average year. And there was an increase of 79% of people with dementia dying at home. And this is what happened in the UK, but what happened in other countries? So is all this story was also happening in different countries across the world, or it was different in other places? To respond to this question, so along with a large group of collaborators, we conducted an investigation examining mortality in people with dementia in 9 countries, in both high and low income countries. So this was an investigation that we started soon after the pandemic kicked off, and we completed in August and got published in August last year. And the data that I'm gonna discuss now applies to the first wave of COVID. So I'm referring to data, things that happened during the first half of 2020. And what we highlight in this report is first that very few countries had official data about deaths of people with dementia at the national level. And you can see it here. You can see here, you know, how there were a lot of countries lacking this data. But for those who did have official data, also you can see that it is, you know, the percentage of people among the total of the population that died of COVID and had dementia was really concerning. So 25% of all deaths in England and Wales were on people with dementia. And although there was little data about how many people with dementia died of COVID in care homes, so it was again very difficult to find this data in these 9 countries, we were, however, able to estimate, to run our own analysis based on other figures and epidemiological studies and some other sources of reference that we had for some of the countries. So we were able to estimate that people with dementia accounted for between 1/3 and 1/2 of all deaths happening in care homes in some of the countries. So these are really very concerning figures that I think that we are just starting to understand the magnitude, the extent of the tragedy that this pandemic has involved, of course, for many people, but in particular for those living with dementia and their families. And a very, very important topic for me, apart from mortality and the massive impact that the pandemic in general has had on people with dementia, something that it is at the core of my research at the moment, and I feel very strongly about, is the impact of the isolation measures on the lives of people with dementia. And I want to tell you now about the consequences of these measures on people with dementia around the world. So, well, of course, almost all countries have experienced nationwide lockdowns, so we all know what we are talking about. And in general, public policies to control the spread of COVID-19 have involved some degree of physical distancing and isolation. Again, we are all very familiar with that. And this has been a novel and strange change for all, but what did it mean for people with dementia? So what I'm going to show you now are the results from a review of 1 year of evidence on the topic that we are about to publish, where we look at the effect of isolation and confinement on 3 variables in people with dementia. So we look at how isolation impacted the cognitive status of people with dementia, their neuropsychiatric symptoms, and their level of independence for activities of daily living. So we dig into the literature and we conducted our research, and we end up identifying 15 relevant papers on the topic. The majority of them were looking at the effect of confinement on people with dementia living in the community. Not much research in care homes, although we know that people in care homes have really paid the biggest toll. This lack of research in care homes probably have to do with the difficulty to conduct research in care homes during the pandemic, given the circumstances. And in total, these papers, all of them together, they examined a sample of more than 6,000 people living with dementia. So this is documenting the experience during the pandemic of really a huge sample of people. And this is a summary of our results. And I want to give you a few seconds. I'm going to stop talking to give you a bit of a space to read these results and also to take a screenshot for those of you interested in keeping this slide. So I'm gonna give you a few seconds now. So what we found was that the majority of studies reported changes in neuropsychiatric symptoms, which appear to get worse during the pandemic. And not only that, but also new neuropsychiatric symptoms seemed to appear and start developing as a result of the isolation and confinement measures in many cases. The neuropsychiatric symptoms more commonly reported were depression, anxiety, apathy, and agitation. So this really is picturing a very, very distressing scenario, both for people living with dementia and their families. Then we have less studies looking at changes in cognition, but those that did report worsening in several cognitive functions. And actually something particularly relevant here is that the 77 of all, 77% of the studies scrutinized described a decline in cognition in more than 50% of respondents, which is really like a very big, very large group of people reporting worsening. And what kind of symptoms do they report? So what caregivers said and what families said was that the relatives with dementia were experiencing a deterioration in memory and orientation, confusion, and more difficulties for communication. And finally, we had just a few studies looking at the level of independence. But again, these few studies, the majority of them reported a decline in the level of independence, in the level of, in the capacity of the people to accomplish activities of daily living in an independent way. So to recap my talk, just to highlight these three messages that altogether I'm aware draw a very concerning picture. So people with dementia really has been in a very difficult position during COVID with high mortality rates, with their human rates not always being preserved, and with the COVID-19 control measures really harming their cognitive and mental health and probably accelerating their decline. And that is also why in this paper that it is at the moment, this rapid review is at the moment submitted, and the preprint will be soon available. And I wanted to share with you the calls for action that we make in this paper. So I'm not gonna go through all of them, but again, I wanted to share them with you. These are 4 specific calls for action that we think are really, really very urgent to make, and that we really invite policymakers and authorities to look at this with a lot of attention and to take action as soon as possible, because the effect of this pandemic on people with dementia has been really devastating. And I think that, well, if any of you feel very strongly about supporting the rights of people with dementia and really want to take a screenshot of this slide and share with others or in social media, I'm very happy for you to do so. And just to wrap up, a big thank you to all the people that make all this research and this work possible. These are all the people that contributed with data to my research and investigations, and people who prove every day their strong commitment to conduct research in dementia and advancing knowledge and try to improve the lives of those living with the condition. Thank you very much. I'm gonna now, I think, handing over to my colleague, Ross Paterson, who's got an exciting talk about the effect of COVID on the human brain.
Thank you very much, Aida. That was a very impactful talk indeed. If you just give me a moment while I share my screen. Okay, so like many doctors, I was involved in looking after patients with COVID-19 over the last year. And as a researcher, I've also spent some of my research time trying to understand this disease in real time. And one of the questions that I've been particularly interested in is whether the virus that causes COVID, the SARS-CoV-2, actually damages the nervous system. And although this is a medical flavored talk, I'm going to try and address some questions that I hope will have some general interest. For instance, what are the neurological problems that are recognized in association with COVID-19? How common are they? And I'll say now that the specific syndromes that I'm going to describe here are pretty rare, and the vast majority of people who have COVID do not experience significant neurological manifestations. I'll talk a bit about how damage actually occurs and how we expect we might find out more about disease mechanisms. And although Aida's spoken about this in general terms, I'm also going to deal specifically mechanistically about what the implications are for people with dementia. So we know that COVID affects the brain, and we know that it also affects the spinal nerves. So these are the nerves that bring power and sensation from our arms and legs and allow them to communicate with our brains. And how do we know this? Well, we used good old-fashioned clinical skills, so listening to patients and examining patients at the bedside. This is Dr. Paul Jarman and I taking to the wards last February. We had access to brain imaging. We had access to blood samples and spinal fluid samples. And also in some cases, we even had genetic samples and access to brain tissue where patients sadly died. And we published this last summer, and this was just a descriptive study of the kinds of problems that were seen in acute COVID-19 disease. And the point of this slide is not to look at the detail, but just to give you a sense of the range of problems that we're seen. And my job now, I guess, and this is in the public domain for those of you who are interested in looking at the detail, but my job now really, I think, is just to walk you through the different clinical syndromes and try and summarize the generalities. So we know that COVID affects the brain. And let's look first of all at blood vessels. And if a blood vessel is blocked, if one of the blood vessels, the arteries that brings nutrients and oxygen to the brain is blocked, then that causes a stroke. And you can see here that this is an angiogram. So these are the arteries supplying the brain, and this side is normal. You can see that they're nicely filling. On this side, the artery comes to an abrupt end, and all the smaller vessels in this side of the brain are missing, which means that they've been obstructed, most likely by a clot. So this is evidence of a stroke. And in a different sort of MR imaging, you can see here the damage that's occurred as a result of that blockage. And so this would manifest as a stroke, so causing sudden and new symptoms such as facial weakness, limb weakness, speech impairment, or other, there are other symptoms, or a combination of them. And in patients with acute COVID, we were seeing this happening in young patients, so people under the age of 65, and we were seeing involvement of large blood vessels in people that we wouldn't have expected to have strokes, so they didn't have other risk factors. We also saw evidence of blood clots in other areas of the body, not the brain, such as the lungs. This is an example of a lung clot. And one of the striking things was that these were people who didn't have severe COVID infection. So these are not people who were admitted to intensive care because of real severe difficulty breathing. These were relatively mild COVID cases who developed severe neurological complications. We also saw damage to the myelin sheath that covers the nerves. And this caused a syndrome known as ADEM, or acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. Now that's just a really long Latin term for the sudden appearance of these white spots in the brain, as you can see in this MR image. And this might present with a range of neurological problems, drowsiness, and it is certainly a very severe consequence of acute COVID infection, but rare. And finally, we know that COVID can affect the nerve cells themselves. And this is just a fairly extreme example of a case of encephalitis, where you can see that there's abnormalities of the cortex of the brain. So this bright signal here in the hippocampus and limbic system is an example of encephalitis. But we also saw cases where there weren't striking changes in the brain imaging or in the spinal fluid. So we saw quite frequently a syndrome known as encephalopathy, which might manifest as new confusion or difficulty following a conversation or seizures. And this was a temporary state where people would become very confused during their hospital admission, a little bit like delirium, but it would reverse quite rapidly as their COVID was treated. And we also saw a number of mental health problems. So people in the context of acute infection developing anxiety, depression, or even psychosis. So the second area of the nervous system involved is the spinal nerves, and specifically the myelin, which covers these nerves. Now, the nerves that come from our spinal cord to our limbs are often very long, sometimes 1 meter in length. And in order to work efficiently, they're covered by this insulating material in green. And that material is what seems to have been damaged in some cases of COVID, causing a syndrome known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. And this is a syndrome that's very well recognized in a number of infections. And it would typically occur not in the acute infection, but in the wake of the acute infection 2 or 3 weeks later. And again, in people with pretty mild respiratory disease, who then develop this severe neurological complication. So I think the next important question is, well, how common are these neurological problems? And certainly last January, when the data started coming out of China, the first paper that was published showed that up to a third of patients who were hospitalized with COVID had some form of neurological symptom. And this is a chart of the various symptoms that were seen. I think in reality, it's turned out not to be as frequent an association as we perhaps thought. And many of these symptoms are common symptoms and not necessarily directly related to the disease mechanism. We were certainly expecting some neurological complications following previous viral infections with similar coronaviruses. But in Queen Square, which was a bit of a hub in London for collecting these cases, we saw about 50 cases in the first wave, so relatively rare. There is a national study in progress through an organization called Coronerve, which is a national collaborative effort with the Association of British Neurologists to try and capture better what was happening on a nationwide basis. So I think there's already a lot we don't know about this. I think the point I want to make is that these serious complications are probably quite rare. The next question that I've been particularly interested in is understanding how damage actually occurs. What is the disease mechanism? And I think at this stage, what we can see is there are probably several different and complicated biological mechanisms that we haven't fully grappled with yet. But what we do know is that inflammation is important. And we know that abnormalities in blood clotting are also important. The question of whether the virus actually enters the brain and nerve cells, I think, is still an open question. We do know that coronaviruses enter cells through a specific receptor, and this receptor is expressed in nerve cells. But in the evidence to date, so the spinal fluid samples and brain tissue that we have available to us, we haven't consistently found evidence of virus in the brain. So I think we need to keep an open mind to that. And I think that will also predict what future complications we might expect to see in the wake of acute COVID-19. And I think the other point I'd like to make is that having neurological symptoms doesn't necessarily indicate damage to the nervous system. And the reason I say this is that we have done some work on this. So together with my colleague, Dr. Laura Benjamin, we collected a number of blood and spinal fluid samples from patients during the first wave back at the beginning of last year. And we collected samples from those with neurological syndromes, those who had COVID who didn't have any neurological problems, and then other control samples, so people who were healthy controls. And we measured a particular protein called neurofilament light. Now, neurofilament light is a really sensitive marker of any form of nerve damage, and you can conveniently measure it in the blood. And what we found is that, yes, this was elevated in people with COVID who were admitted to hospital, but in people who had COVID and were just managed at home and had their community COVID illness, you can see here that their levels of this protein are very low. And that suggests that these people didn't have significant injury to their nervous system. And in fact, you can see that they're actually lower than our control group here. So my second take-home point is having COVID doesn't inevitably cause damage to the nervous system. And I thought I would say a little bit about implications for people living with dementia. We've heard from Aida about the awful associations with dementia and mortality. But what I would say about these specific neurological syndromes is that they don't seem to be particularly related to people with pre-existing diagnosis of dementia. In fact, they seem to be more common in people who were younger without other medical problems. And whether that's just an artifact of the people who actually made it into hospital and who we saw, I don't know. But we don't have evidence that these are increased in people with dementia. The second question that comes up quite often is whether the actual biological process that drives the different forms of dementia is actually altered by COVID. And at the moment, again, I think that's an open question, but we don't have evidence that the biological process of dementia is actually altered in any way. We do have subtle signals that perhaps amyloid processing changes in some way during acute COVID infection, but not necessarily in the longer term. So that requires some more work. So I thought I'd just put some additional resources for people who might wish further information. And this is the CoroNerve project that I mentioned. So they have a good website that has quite a lot of additional information. For people who are worried about their mental health, I know that Mind has a very good section on COVID and mental health. And I know that a lot of people are concerned about long COVID and the later complications, particularly in the nervous system of having had COVID. And a lot is not known about that, but there are now National Institute of Clinical Excellence, so NICE guidelines on how people who are concerned about this should be managed, both from a clinical and a research perspective. So I would encourage anybody who has questions or is interested to look up the new NICE guideline, which has just been released. So finally, I would like to thank all the people who have helped me with the research that we've done around COVID, and particularly the research participants, the patients who had COVID and very kindly consented to being involved in our research studies when they weren't feeling terribly well. And also to the cross-disciplinary colleagues who helped to run in a very collaborative way the various studies that we've done around COVID so far. And finally to my funders, particularly NIHR, who funded our COVID biomarker study, and to the UK DRI, which AR UK is a major funder. So thank you very much, and I'll just return you to Katy.
Thank you so much, Ross. And also we'll just wait for Aida to join us back on screen. Both of your talks, really interesting, quite hard hitting as well. So we've had some questions come through while we've been on, but there were a couple of questions that came through ahead of time, which actually I thought would be good to start with. So Aida, you spoke about the impact of the pandemic on people with dementia, particularly because of the social distancing and the lockdowns and the impact that's had. Some of the people sending questions ahead of the event were asking about activities that their loved ones with dementia were doing before the pandemic, so going for daily walks and activity. They've stopped those at the moment, but would you expect to see that they'd be able to return to some of those activities, or is is it kind of too far gone in a lot of these cases?
I think that there is not a straight response for that. Some people will probably be able to return to their previous activities, and for other people, for a wide variety of reasons, will be far more difficult. So for instance, people who are in more severe stages of the disease are people who will find more difficult to get back to baseline levels for obvious reasons. And this will also have to do with the level of support, with for how long these restrictions will keep going. So there is a variety of reasons. But I think that so there is an element in all this, which is the support that the families need to keep the routines going. It is also easier for families with a higher level of support, like for instance, families who can allow carers into the house, or who live in neighborhoods where there are resources still ongoing, like day centers that are still providing support. So it really depends on many things, and many variables are affecting this and will continue affecting this.
Fab, thank you. And one of the questions that's come through during the talks was from Kate, and she has asked, can you comment on the impact of the pandemic on people living with dementia from ethnic minority backgrounds? So from some of the studies you mentioned, Aida, was there anything you could draw out from that about different ethnic minorities?
Yeah. So actually, this is not a topic that I've investigated, but I'm aware of some papers out there. Actually, the one that I mentioned from the States, they are looking specifically at ethnic minorities, because there are some pieces of evidence emerging and suggesting that they've been more severely impacted, but not only people with dementia, ethnic minorities in general. Yeah, which may have to do with demographics, but yes, Ross, please.
I was just going to make a comment that there were certainly a number of individuals in our case series of these severe neurological presentations who were from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. So they're certainly represented in the literature. Whether there are increased numbers of complications, I don't think we've got a big enough data set to know that.
Thank you. Yes. Another question from someone during the event. It's quite a long one, so I am going to read it out. So she says, my 59-year-old brother caught COVID in hospital. He didn't get symptoms until about a week back at home, collapsed with a seizure, and has since been given a working diagnosis of early dementia. But there was also a discussion about delirium. He was incredibly confused, couldn't finish a sentence or find the right words. He has improved, but still isn't back to normal. Could this be COVID rather than dementia? And I guess, Ross, this kind of links in with what you were saying about the evidence is emerging, but do you think you can comment on that?
I'm always cautious about giving individual clinical advice in a public forum. But what I would say is that having a seizure always raises concern that this is not dementia. Now, of course, seizures are common in dementia, but as a presenting feature in the context of an acute illness, that would always raise a concern. And in that sort of situation, I would usually be thinking about doing a lumbar puncture to see if there's any evidence of inflammation or infection in the nervous system.
And I guess one of the other things is that the clinical follow-up that's likely happening will shed more light on what's going on with more tests, like you say.
And it's always in context, you know, what happened before the admission to hospital and what was the run-in and were there symptoms that were leading up to this. So it's difficult just with a kind of snapshot of information to.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's hard to give kind of a clear-cut answer sometimes on these, but thank you for taking that one. I guess a bit more of a general question, but it does kind of touch on some of the things you mentioned. So do people with dementia and Alzheimer's have hallucinations as a kind of general symptom? I don't know who wants to take that. Do you want to go, Ross?
Yeah, I'll take that. So hallucinations can occur. If hallucinations are a prominent part of the clinical presentation, we often think about another disease known as dementia with Lewy bodies, where hallucinations are one of the kind of core clinical features. So yeah, I think yes, they can occur in Alzheimer's disease, but I would be thinking about other things as well.
Thank you. Another question that's come through during the event, and they acknowledge this might be quite a difficult one to answer. Do you have figures, like percentage-wise, for any brain damage from COVID? What about mortality percentages among those with brain damage? So I think you've kind of touched on this already, Ross, about what effect COVID might be having on the brain, but are there any kind of percentages around that, or is it too early to tell?
We just don't know, because, you know, during the first wave of COVID, there just wasn't the ability to capture all of the cases. We weren't even testing people, so people who were at home with their COVID illness didn't even have access to a viral PCR swab. So we've got no way of knowing what the percentage of these was. I mean, we only saw, this is a case series, so we only saw people who managed to present and who were somehow fed into our system. But in terms of what the denominator was, we've no idea. So in terms of estimating a mortality based on that, we just can't say.
And I guess, yeah, the longer term studies, time will tell. More research is needed, as we often say on these things. So going to some of the questions we've had ahead of time. I know, Ada, you spoke quite a bit about the impact of isolation on people with dementia. And somebody writing in said that they asked whether you're aware of others who feel guilt around what's happened to their loved ones from being in a care home and wish that they could have dealt with COVID differently. Is this something you've come across from areas of your work?
Yes, so, well, there is a massive issue about the ban on visits, and this has been, you know, a very controversial measure, and it is easing now, but it's been really hard for families and people, and also for care home managers, and also for care home workers. I don't think that there is anything that the families could have done, because this has gone completely beyond their control. These were public policy measures in a situation completely exceptional, as it is a pandemic. And I think that there is nothing that a family or a relative could have done, because we didn't have any experience in how to deal with a pandemic. So this really took the world, you know, completely by surprise. And I think that we are learning now how to deal with this situation. But it is very easy to say now, oh, 12 months ago, we could have done this and this, but we didn't know, we didn't have any experience. We didn't even know how to protect ourselves from the virus during the first weeks. So I think that it is a very difficult situation, but I don't see what a family could have done to manage the situation different if their loved one was living in a care home.
Yeah, the situation was so restrictive, and yeah,
absolutely, I echo that. I think it's absolutely heartbreaking for families, and people absolutely shouldn't feel guilt. This was a public health decision. People did not have a choice.
Yeah, thank you. Slightly different area, but maybe something you might be able to comment on, where you might not be able to. Are you aware of any research being carried out for any brain damage that might be done by vaccine or after vaccination? I don't know if this is specifically to do with COVID, but just in general. I
don't think we've got any evidence that the vaccine causes any brain damage. So I don't think that's, well, we certainly know from the data from the 2 vaccines that are widely available were studied in a large cohort of people, and we didn't see any of the complications that I've described. And typically these occur in the subacute period, so you know, within the days or within a couple of weeks of administering the vaccine. So we ought to have had the ability to capture that if these were, you know, major and common complications.
Yeah, there's I know there's a system, it's called the yellow card system, which is where side effects of any medication, vaccines, whether it's COVID or otherwise, are reported. So those sorts of things are being measured, and it's up to the kind of regulatory authorities that are monitoring those to make sure that they're picking up on any worrying trends. But as you say, there's nothing showing of that at the moment. We haven't got any more questions coming through live. And we've got a few general questions that were submitted ahead of time. So let me just pick one of those that I think might be a useful one for you to answer. Actually, I think I'm going to go for this one because it's one that we get quite a lot. So I think it's one that people want to know an answer to. Different tack completely though. Both my parents passed away with dementia. Will I get dementia? It's a question I'm sure you hear quite a lot in your work. So I wonder if you could give us an answer for that one.
Yes, I can talk a little bit about the risk, and it really does depend on the form of dementia that you're referring to. There are very rare causes of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, that can run in families, where you have a gene and it goes from one generation to the next, and there's a 50% chance of any children carrying inheriting the gene. But these forms of dementia are really pretty rare, and the clinical presentation is usually at a young age, and often the gene is known about in the family. If it's just a case that your parents developed dementia in their late 60s, 70s, then your own genetic risk of having a first-degree relative will be no higher than mine. And these are considered sporadic cases. Now, there are some risk factor genes which do play into things, and that gets more complicated, but we don't test them clinically. And so I think the answer is we should think about these as genetic cases and non-genetic cases. And if you're not a gene carrier, then your risk will be no higher than mine.
That was a brilliant answer. Thank you very much, Ross. Well, I'm aware that we are approaching 4 o'clock, and I do like to keep these things sticking to time. So I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you, Ross and Aida, for sharing your work. It's very timely, really interesting, very hard hitting. So thank you so much for giving your talks today and answering all our questions. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. So as we're about to wrap up, if we can just hold on a few seconds longer, I've got another poll that I'd like you to fill in. So this will just help us understand how today has gone. It's just popped up on the screen now. So it's whether you've enjoyed the events today, whether you'd recommend them to your friends and family, and if you plan on attending future events in the series. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to click away, put in your poll results. And then hold on 1 second longer. And if we could have a look at the results and just get a sense of how today has gone for everyone, that would be great. Oh, there we go. Oh, wonderful. So people have enjoyed it, they've learned something, and they plan to attend again. That's fantastic. It's really wonderful to have such a engaged audience with so many questions. So thank you so much for coming along today. So as well as that poll, we will be sending a feedback survey along with the video recording of the event in the next few days. So look out for that in your email inbox, and please do complete the survey, as we'd appreciate any feedback you can give us so we can continue to improve these events. The next event in our series is on the 31st of March, and it is at midday. And we'll hear from researchers from our Midlands network about brain health, from the population studies that guide recommendations through to the studies at the cellular level in the brain, understanding how factors can converge and lead to the development of dementia. So do check out the website for more details and to register for what is sure to be another really interesting event. I did mention earlier our petition that's open at the moment, and we're so grateful to have Dame Julie Walters standing with us at the moment and those who've signed it so far. So if you are interested in supporting our call to government to increase funding for dementia research, please do check out the petition page and consider signing it. I know we had questions in advance, and there may be some that we weren't able to answer today, and that you also may be looking for more information about COVID. So on the screen, there are a couple of kind of places you can turn to, and we're putting some of those links in the chat at the moment as well, and they'll also be on the event page with the recording. So just to flag are the NHS Your COVID Recovery website, which has lots of information about different symptoms, how people are recovering from COVID, and a really good source of information. Another one I wanted to flag was the long COVID support group, which has resources, guidance and support for people with long COVID. And there's also information about how people can get involved in research studies if they've had COVID, and how that can build our understanding of the impact of the virus. Our Dementia Research info line is also on hand to answer any questions and signpost you to sources of information and support. So please do get in touch with them, as they'll be happy to help. So that's it from me and from our speakers. So as we close, I want to say a huge thank you for coming along today, for your support for the charity, and I hope you've enjoyed it and will join us again for another event in our series. Hope you're keeping safe and well. Thank you for attending, and goodbye.